All right, Literacy Leadership Mentors. We are in a call with Dr. Charles Hulme, and we are advancing our dialogue on leading with data. I'm Dr. Nell, joining you from Montana and seeing your faces out there. I'm seeing people from Colorado, California, Florida, Maryland. This is exciting, all over the place. Wisconsin, Texas. So we are ready to hear Dr. Hulme. He's actually, to me, a dear friend. He's like more than just a mentor. He's a friend, and I appreciate him greatly, mostly for his humility, his willingness to be in hard dialogues, that he makes it so easy to talk about hard things, and in the science. And I really appreciate it. And today we're advancing our thinking about what it takes to screen our students in early literacy. We listened to Jack Fletcher last week, and my guiding question last week was, what are you doing to assess word reading? And are you finding the students who have those word reading difficulties and dyslexia? Are you finding the true positives, the ones who truly have the difference? And what does it mean to have false positives? We started to dive into questions like that. But then we said, but what about language? Are we screening language? And I said, wait, I happen to know somebody. How about I email him and see if he'll join us? So Charles said yes, and here we are. So you are in for a treat. I'm going to let him take over. He has a PowerPoint to talk us through what language screening looks like from his perspective. Go ahead, Charles.
Thanks, Nell. Very nice to be here and meet you all. Nell, could you put up the slides and
I'm going to
take it from there.
My Mac has too many windows open, everybody. So we're going to just do slideshow and presenter view. And here we go, Charles. I think that it's going to pop up in 2 seconds.
Perfect. I can see that. Can everybody see that?
Perfect. And that's our first slide. So go ahead.
Okay.
And yep, this is the one. I'll let you just take it away. And everybody, this is meant to be a mentorship opportunity. So please drop questions in the chat box if you have them. Will Dr. Hulme teach us, and then we can chat about it and go from there, okay? So if you would, just turn your mics off and we'll let him take it away.
Thanks very much, Nell. I'll just turn my phone off. Thanks very much. Very nice to be here with you all. I'm going to talk to you about language, what it is, how it develops, why it sometimes doesn't develop, and what we can do to assess it and to make it develop better. So what is oral language? Well, oral language is critical for education, but I think it's not very well understood. Language is a complicated set of processes. Linguists distinguish between 4 different systems of language: phonology, semantics, grammar, and pragmatics. So when we speak, we're juggling many skills or processes. Which words we're using, that's vocabulary. The sounds of those words, that's phonology. The order in which those words occur in a sentence, that's grammar. What words and sentences mean, that's semantics. And how we choose to express that meaning, and what meanings are appropriate to express in different settings, and that's pragmatics, or the socially appropriate use of language. So language is a complicated system, and it's a cyclical system with a continuous interaction between speaking and listening, which we sometimes refer to by their technical names of expressive and receptive language skills. If we talk about receptive language skills first, to understand spoken language, children need to be able to listen and to attend. They need to understand the meanings of words that are being spoken. They need to understand how those words are conjoined into sentences and to process the words and sentences and longer strings of language into an overall meaning or message. And to communicate effectively with language, children need to be able to choose the right words. They need to be able to plan a sentence. They need to be able to combine words into sentences and sentences into narratives or longer, more extensive sets of utterances. And they need to be able to speak clearly and fluently. Notice here I'm talking about language, I'm not talking about speech. Speech is how we articulate the words in the sounds in words. I'm talking about language being the more central aspects of communication. Speech is important, but I'm making a particular emphasis here on language rather than speech. If we could move to the next slide now. Why is language so important? Well, I'm on a kind of crusade to convince people that oral language skills form the foundation for the whole of formal education. Oral language skills are without doubt the foundation for all aspects of literacy: reading accuracy, reading comprehension, spelling and writing, all depend on having good levels of oral language skills. Oral language skills are also critical for developing arithmetic. Counting skills are a very clear example of a language system that's involved in arithmetic. And more broadly, language is what I refer to as the medium of instruction. Nearly all of the learning that occurs in formal education occurs in the context of a teacher presenting information in language and a student understanding what's being said to them. And language skills are also critical for social and emotional development and friendship formation. Okay, if we move on. Yeah, I've just said that. Social and emotional development are both really also critically dependent on a child's ability to understand what's said to them and to communicate with others around them. Moving on. Language is critical for reading. And when we talk about reading, it's critical to distinguish two different aspects of reading: decoding and comprehension. According to the simple view of reading, reading comprehension depends on these two separable skills: the ability to decode print, translate print into sound, and the ability to relate the speech that's generated from that via processes that are involved in language comprehension. There's a massive body of research that I've contributed to that establishes that the simple view of reading is a really critical for understanding how reading develops. And recent research indicates that language skills are the foundation for both decoding or translating speech into sound, translating print into sound, and for the development of reading comprehension as well. Therefore, assessing language skills is absolutely critical for planning children's education. If we can move on, Nell. Now, developmental language disorder is the current terminology for children who experience problems in developing oral language. Developmental language disorder is still not widely recognized, but the best estimates are that somewhere between 7 and 10% of the school population suffer from developmental language disorder, or at least developmental language weaknesses. Developmental language disorder, or DLD, is identified when language doesn't develop as we expect it to. It's not part of a general developmental delay, but children with DLD often are not recognized in school, I think. But the sorts of telltale signs of a child having DLD is that they may be quiet, not talk very much. When they do speak, their language seems immature. They may have a lot of trouble finding the words they need to use. Many of these children have problems in understanding what's said to them, so-called receptive language problems. And in older children, many of them fail to understand language that they read, even if they can decode it to some degree. If we can move on now. Now, for me, because language is so important and because teachers are not trained necessarily to recognize language problems, it's very important to have readily available language assessments that teachers can use. What do language assessments need to be able to do? They need to be quick to use. They need to be objective and reliable. They need to be accurate and provide us with age standardized results. And they need to provide teachers with reliable, accurate assessments that are easy to conduct and where the data is readily accessible. And they then provide teachers with a way of identifying students who would benefit from targeted interventions or additional support. If we can go on now. So standardized assessment is one that's been given to a large group of children of different ages to establish the normal range of performance. And scores from standardized assessments are often expressed in terms of percentile scores. I've got here a snippet from a report from our language assessment called Language Screen, where it lists children's scores in terms of their percentile scores. Common cutoffs for disorder are either a 16th percentile, that's the bottom 16% of the population, or the 10th percentile, the bottom 10%. If we could move on to the next slide now. So we developed Language Screen, which is an automated app running on an Android or Apple tablet or phone. Language Screen consists of 4 subtests: a measure of expressive vocabulary, which is a naming test. How many pictures can a child name? A measure called listening comprehension, in which a child hears a sequence of short spoken stories and is asked questions about them by the app. A measure of receptive vocabulary. The child hears a sequence of spoken words and has to identify which picture on the screen corresponds to each spoken word. And finally, a measure called sentence repetition, where children hear a sequence of sentences from very short, simple sentences to longer, more complex sentences, and they simply have to repeat those sentences verbatim. If we can move on now. So Language Screen combines those 4 different scores to produce an age standardized profile for each child. This is showing the profile for a fictitious boy called Albert Harris, and it's showing their total standard score as being 73. A standard score is like an IQ score, where the average score for a child's age is 100. And what you can see is that this child has got below average scores on all 4 of the subtests in Language Screen, and their overall standard score is 73, which is a very poor score indeed. If we could move on to the next slide.
Hey, Charles. Hey, Charles, Nell here. We have a question from the audience. Could you
Oh, sure.
Could you elaborate on why sentence repetition is such a powerful tool in understanding developmental language differences?
Oh, sure. But that's a really good question. It's something I almost said more about and then thought I wouldn't. Sentence repetition is well recognized as one of the most sensitive measures of developmental language disorder. This seems a very surprising finding. The reason it's such a good measure of language disorder is that it's very sensitive to grammatical difficulties, problems in understanding the grammatical structure of sentences. And the reason for that relates to a rather deeper set of research, which is that if I say a sentence to you, if I say to you, my mother is friendly and a warm and lovely person, the way you would repeat that is not simply to hold on to a verbatim record of what I've said. What you do is you process the meaning of what I've said and then regenerate the sentence from your understanding of it. So you don't simply record in a verbatim way what I've said. You process the meaning of what I've said and then you regenerate the sentence from your understanding of it. So sentence repetition paradoxically tackles things to do with your ability to understand the grammatical structure of a sentence and then to produce that grammatical structure again from your understanding of it.
Thank you, Charles. That was fantastic. Really gets after semantics and our understanding of word order, and
Yeah,
very important.
yeah. But it's counterintuitive. Most people think this is a really dumb test. It's just listening and repeating what you've heard, but the way you repeat is complicated. This is an expanded view of part of a language screen report, which gives a full breakdown of this child's language profile and gives written feedback which can be incorporated into reports that schools may use and explains all the terminology used. If we could move on now. So here's a snapshot of part of the language screen report. What language screen does is produce a ranked list of all the children within a class, a year group, or indeed within the whole school, ranked in terms of their standard scores or percentile ranks. And we use this so-called traffic light system to indicate the level of language skill that a child has. A red symbol indicating that a child's language skills are a clear cause for concern, an amber warning saying that there are slight concerns, and a green symbol indicating that this child's language skills are basically not a cause for concern. So language screen gives the school a very rapid way of identifying the range of language skills within the school or the class or the year group, and also the numbers of children whose language skills are a real cause for concern. Nell, were you going to say something?
I do have a question on this data. And I think for our leaders out there, it's really important. When we did a pilot study in Livingston, Montana, we chose a cut point score of anything of 80 and below. And we had several children we had that needed intervention. And I want to be clear, we chose that cut point because we were resource taxed, which means we didn't have enough teachers to do all of the interventions. And therefore we needed to pick the most critical needs to apply that resource to. And then we moved that cut point up to 90 and said, okay, any student that hasn't scored 90 or below, we're going to ensure that they have an extra dose of language intervention. And I know we've talked a bit about that, and I would love to hear your thoughts around helping schools understand what the cut points of risk are on here.
Oh, thanks, Nell. So to be clear, the cut points are to some degree arbitrary, and I think a big virtue of Language Screen is that it gives you the range of scores present in your class or classes. I agree with you that probably kids maybe with language scores, standard scores of 90 or below, might warrant some additional language enrichment. But for the purposes of simplicity, I think we set the amber cutoff at 85 and the red cutoff at, I think, 79 on Language Screen. But where you place those cutoffs is to some degree arbitrary. I think the important point to note is that we've used this now in many thousands of schools in the UK and also in other places. Language Screen's being translated into Dutch, it's being used in Holland, it's being used in the US, it's being used in Australia. And consistently, teachers tell us it's incredibly revealing to see the scores from children in their classes, and that some of the children who are identified as having language difficulties by Language Screen are not a surprise to the children, but not a surprise to the teachers. But consistently, the teachers say there are a small number of children who are identified by Language Screen as having the language difficulties that the teachers had no idea were having language problems. So I think it's very important in placing this objective, easy to use, automated measure into the hands of teachers in order that they can then recognize the range of language skills and how frequent language difficulties are in the classes they're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think that once we started taking the data with 137 students in the data set, it was pretty clear there's a normative sample, and there's the students who are below the 25th percentile, and the ones that surprise you the most are the ones who get the intervention and pop right up into the normative sample. The ones that are, for us, even more surprising, that we thought were fine but stayed consistently at risk. One standard to standard and a half below, so about an 80 to an 85. Their scores were consistently at risk, while a student who may have scored a 72 in the beginning, when they got great intervention, they popped up to 97. And we were like, whoa, the intervention really made a difference. And so we really could see the sensitivity after applying the work, which was the intervention work. Everybody, you have to know out there, unlike CBMs and word recognition, this does not have progress monitoring. So these are your checkpoints about every 6 months, right, Dr. Hulme?
Yeah, yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take you on to the next slide.
Thank you. Language Screen is administered by school staff. It takes about 10 minutes per child. It's incredibly accurate. This shows some statistics from a huge study we did in which we assessed some 6,000 children with Language Screen, or schools assessed some 6,000 children with Language Screen. The bottom children, the worst performing children in each class, we then sent specially trained speech and language therapists in to do a half-hour assessment with each of the low-performing children. And what this shows is that the score from Language Screen correlated 0.95 with the scores from a half-hour assessment by specially trained speech and language therapists. So we got pretty well identical results from a 10-minute assessment by school staff who hadn't been trained by us, with an assessment that took half an hour by especially trained speech and language therapists. So Language Screen is both highly reliable and it's validated against some of the best standardized measures of language that are used clinically in the US and the UK. If we could move on now.
We have two very important questions in the chat box, Charles.
Oh, sure.
The first one comes, which is a question I know we've chatted about priorly. What is the level of English proficiency that you recommend a student that's a multilingual learner have before they can be screened with Language Screen and for it to be valuable? Or what have you seen around MLL or ELL considerations?
Okay, so to be clear, Language Screen is a measure of a child's English language skills. But if a child is being taught in an English language school, I think Language Screen provides school staff with a very clear measure of that child's English language proficiency. That's not to say they may. So some children who come to school with limited exposure to English may well score badly on Language Screen because of lack of language experience, essentially. But that's very important for the school to know. And the data from our interventions is that children with poor language skills, due to coming from non-English language backgrounds, respond very well to intervention. So I mean, obviously, if a child literally cannot speak any English, there's no point in trying to use Language Screen with them. But if they've got some rudimentary English language skills, in terms of age equivalence, Language Screen goes down to children who have language skills of a typical 3-year-old. So if you're in kindergarten or K-12 classrooms, I would say it should be suitable for any of those children to be assessed in terms of their give a valid assessment of their English language skills.
Because it's covering the developmental span from 3 years to about 9 years, right?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And if they're developing English in a kindergarten classroom and have been in the room, let's just say about 6 months, using Language Screen could be a proxy of how they're developing the language.
Completely correct, Nell. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question is important. It comes from Lynn Kuhn. Have you done any trials or is there any evidence to where this tool could be transferable to older DLD students to glean what their abilities are within the Language Screen? And that seems completely appropriate. Like if they're DLD, but they're 11 years old, but their language skills are that of a 5-year-old, would Language Screen be sensitive to pick that up?
Actually, we've just extended. We are literally, as I speak, just extending Language Screen to be suitable for kids up to 12 years of age or more. And what I'd say is that if you use Language Screen with like an 11-year-old child with DLD, you would get an accurate assessment of their absolute level of language proficiency. It would overestimate their language abilities. But as I say, we're currently just extending Language Screen to go up into the secondary school age range. Yeah.
Well, that is great information. And back to the ELL topic, would it almost be more of a test of working memory and pronunciation for a multilingual learner? Or would they be mimicking versus processing language in any of those tasks?
Well, there are 2 measures of vocabulary, which I think are pretty well working memory demands are pretty well absent. They're very pure measures of vocabulary knowledge, I would say. Sentence repetition, again, is a measure of your grammatical skills. Listening comprehension is a rather rich measure that measures both memory, but also language comprehension and your ability to express your comprehension of what's been used. the evidence is that kids from EL backgrounds, English as an additional language background, do worse on language screen. Also, children from more disadvantaged backgrounds do worse on language screen. But of course, we know these are the children who have poorer language skills and who are doing worse in school as a result of that. So I don't see these as criticisms of the test. I see these as validations of the test, really.
And I think that there's a tag-on question about linguistic diversity, and I think we were talking about that in a different call, Charles, like that corpus of language that child has. And if language screen is asking a question in a certain way, obviously the student, maybe we're not capturing their true language understanding. But that seems to be true in all of our assessments these days, or what would you say about that?
Yeah, I think these issues about cultural issues are quite complex, really. Many children who come from non-typical language or social backgrounds are coming to school disadvantaged because of that. And I think we can't deal with that in the context of a test, but obviously, children who are coming from backgrounds where their language exposure is either different or more limited will be disadvantaged on a test like this, but those children also will be at risk of educational disadvantage because of these differences in their language background, I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Hulme. All right, we're going to move. I wanted to highlight out there all of this speech language pathologist. Did you catch how Dr. Hulme called the self the kelf? Over in the UK, it's called the kelf, and we call it the self. And for all of you who are not speech language pathologists, the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals is one of the main batteries of screening that we give as speech language pathologists to screen for language difference or developmental language disorder when a student is in that final stages of referral. So there you go. All right, I'll move on, Dr. Hulme.
Thanks, Nell. So, why is identifying language skills early so important? Well, it's very important because of what we refer to as the skill gap, sometimes referred to as the Matthew effect. Children who come into school with better skills tend to then go on to improve their skills at a faster rate. So if we can identify children with language weaknesses early, we can provide additional support for those children and try to, if not overcome the Matthew effect, to reduce it. If you just move on to the next slide now.
Yeah, can you, I didn't exactly hear you say this, but I think in light of the questions we just received and you answered, do you think it would be of value to talk about the fact that while those students who had socioeconomic disadvantage or language exposure disadvantage or were English language learners, that while their scores all were more depressed in the research that you've done, they also responded at a really positive rate to the intervention. Am I correct in saying that?
You've got it completely correct. So
and
kids,
that is important in terms of closing the gaps.
it's very important, but also those kids are closing the gap as the result of receiving our Nelly intervention. So those kids who come to school with limited language input at home benefit particularly strongly, actually, from getting highly structured language input in our intervention in school. Yeah.
Are their growth rates different than students who had better language scores at initial assessment? Do you have
That's
growth rate data?
That's a complicated question. The data suggests that the kids from English as additional language backgrounds show faster growth than children from English language backgrounds, but statistically, the difference in those two growth rates aren't different. They
Okay.
tend to be faster in the kids from non-English backgrounds, which makes sense that those kids, many of them don't have a language learning weakness. They've just been deprived of language input at home.
Okay. Well, thank you.
So we have in the UK combined the use of Language Screen with providing schools with access to our NELI programme. NELI stands for the Nuffield Early Language Intervention Programme, and it's now been expanded to be both a targeted intervention for children with weak language skills, and it's also now been developed into a whole class language enrichment program. These programs have been shown to improve language ability in the largest randomized control trial of a language intervention ever conducted. Language Screen is used to select students who are suitable for intervention and to monitor their progress. And NELI is delivered in schools by what I think in the US you'd call teacher aides, who are trained using our online training that takes roughly 15 hours or so, and which in the UK is granted continuing professional development accreditation. And that is highly interactive training that involves a kind of social training model where people get to know each other on the online course and post questions about the materials and the use of our intervention programs.
And Charles,
yeah.
Charles, I just have to remind all the leaders out there that what I have experienced, and my colleagues at Winans Elementary in Livingston, Montana, would attest, is that they actually really loved the online training. Yeah, and I am just so excited about that, because I think that post-pandemic, we were overloaded on Zoom and learning online, yet the way that this translated for educators was really powerful, and it helped change an entire paradigm in beliefs about what we should be doing with early learning environments around language. So I can't say enough positives about that. It's the first time, where I've just said, oh, well, let's just watch the videos. They're really good. And so there you go.
Thanks, Nell. It is true that the training has been incredibly well received. Okay, I've been talking for quite a while now, and I think I should give people the opportunity to ask some more questions. But just to briefly summarize what I've said, I've shown you Language Screen, which is a short, highly accurate, objective measure of children's language skills. I've just told you given you the briefest idea about the NELI program, or programs that are proven to improve children's language skills, both targeted intervention and whole class universal language enrichment. And maybe if we could just hop forward to another, hop forward again, Nell. So the NELI program now has been delivered to roughly 11,000 schools in the UK. It's been translated into Dutch and is being used in Holland. It's being used in Australia. It's been used in the US. And in fact, an independent evaluation of the NELI program in the UK has just been published, showing that when it's rolled out at scale, it continues to be effective. And I quite like this quote from someone who's got nothing to do with me, Professor Becky Francis, who's the chief executive of a body called the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, which is a government-sponsored agency that exists to identify effective methods in education. And she says time and time again, Nelly has been proven its effectiveness. It's hard to overestimate how exciting it is to see a program have a significant positive impact on a national scale. So just to summarize, I think I've shown you evidence that it's possible for schools to quickly and accurately assess children's language abilities, and it's also possible for schools to use interventions that we've developed that work at scale and make a real difference to improving children's language skills, which, as I've argued, are the foundation really for the whole of a child's formal education, and particularly critical for the development of their reading and writing skills. I'll stop there and take any questions if there are any.
Dr. Hulme, this is Nell.
Yeah.
I want to hold you here for a minute because this quote from Professor Becky Francis, it says a significant positive impact on a national scale. Can you help us understand as leaders in the United States what that means? How many schools in the UK use the screener and the intervention? Because I think we as folks in the United States, we are just not used to having a large scale, everybody gets this incredible treatment to the level that you've just won an incredible award for best interventions for children in the world. So help us understand what that means in numbers.
Okay, so we've had funding from the UK government over the last 4 years. As a result of that, we've delivered Language Screen and the Nelly program to somewhere around 11,000 schools. These are schools that are more likely to be in disadvantaged areas than advantaged areas. We've trained over 30,000 teaching staff using our online training. With Language Screen, we've assessed over 500,000 children, which is pretty amazing. We've delivered the Nelly program to well over 100,000 children. So this is something that actually is proven scientifically to work at the largest possible scale. And the challenges in translating this from research into working at scale have been particularly centered around the development of this really excellent online training. And the training trains teachers and teacher aides both in the details of the Nelly program, but it also gives them much broader training about the nature of oral language and how oral language develops and how people can work when they interact with children to facilitate their language development. To quote someone from the UK's Department for Education, every teacher in the country should have your language training. I think that's true.
I think we could say that as leaders in the United States, and the chat box is probably going, yeah. So I would like to finish, Charles, with something that I don't think we should forget. What happens in the simple view of reading is because we talked with Jack Fletcher's thoughts in mind last week, Charles.
Yeah.
So I would like for you to actually address in the simple view of reading, we have word recognition, which is assessed in specific ways, but language is assessed now in the ways that you've taught us today. And then in this tool, OXED also has reading screens. So if you were to want to have a complete scaled simple view of reading, we assess how language develops, and then we assess how early literacy develops. OXED does the entire developmental continuum. And I just want to give it credit because it's the first assessment who really paid attention to actual class reporting based on the simple view of reading. And that's a pretty cool thing. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, Charles?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Nell. So reading screen works using the same technology really underlying language screen. So you can assess a child's word and non-word reading skills using reading screen probably in about 5 to 8 minutes. You then get a score from language screen that's on the vertical axis here, and a score from reading screen on the horizontal axis. And what you can see is that this places all the children you've assessed in this two-dimensional plot. The children at the top right hand of the graph are children with good language and good reading skills, and they're not children we're worried about. Children to the left-hand side at the top are children with what we'd call classically defined dyslexia. They're children with good language skills but poor decoding skills. Then children in the bottom two quadrants, the bottom left-hand quadrant, are children with both poor decoding and poor language skills. They're the children who perhaps are of greatest concern. And then finally, children in the bottom right-hand segment there have good word recognition skills, but poor language comprehension. And those children are referred to often as poor comprehenders. So these are children who can read aloud relatively accurately, but have great difficulty understanding what they're reading. The point about using reading screen and language screen together is that it gives you an instant diagnostic for every child in your school as to which of those four quadrants each child falls into.
So, Charles, we have two important questions. In the United States, most of our state policy and arms and laws ask us if we can progress monitor. So what part of your assessment protocol does it have a progress monitoring piece to it in reading screen especially? And second question, which I think is an easy one, is how long does the Nellie intervention time, how much time? So how much time for Nellie, and do we have progress monitoring?
Yeah, so both reading screen and language screen can be used to monitor progress, but they don't come in alternate formats. So we would say you shouldn't be retesting children on those measures more than, say, a couple of times a year, but they're designed to be used repeatedly with the same children, but at decent time intervals. And they are sensitive to improvements. They're both sensitive to improvements that we get from our large-scale interventions. The Nellie program, the Nellie intervention, the original version of the Nellie intervention is essentially a 20-week program. So it delivered usually over 2 school terms in kindergarten or grade 1 in the US. And it consists of a series of small group and individual sessions delivered by a teacher aide with each a teacher aide would probably be needing to spend about 10 hours a week teaching 5 or 6 children in a class for about 2 hours each across the week in the Nellie program, which is, on the one hand, it's quite a lot of time. On the other hand, the teacher aides in the UK are often doing much lower level activities than this. And the benefits of Nellie are so massive that this seems a very, very good use of time and resources to me.
Charles, to talk about that benefit, I was recently just reminded of research where we understand that 2-year-old vocabulary impacts 8th grade reading comprehension, right? And there's a through line to that understanding of words and semantics that children have, that it impacts later in life. So do you have longitudinal evidence to show how Nellie impacts through reading comprehension age? Like, so as soon as they start reading to comprehend, do those students who receive Nellie, have they done better?
Okay, that's a really good question, Nell, and there's actually quite a lot of evidence relevant to it. First of all, we have evidence that the effects of Nellie are still evident in terms of a child's oral language skills and their word reading skills 2 years after the program has finished. So we give Nellie to children in their first year in school. We do nothing and we go back 2 years after the intervention has finished, and the children who've had Nellie are reading better and have better oral language skills than the children who didn't get Nellie. So that's the durability, which is pretty remarkable. And in one study, but not in another, we found that children who had received the Nellie program showed better reading comprehension, which was related to the improvements in their language comprehension that the Nellie program had produced. And the other critical finding about Nellie is that we found in this very, very large scale randomized trial that the children who had had the Nellie program were rated as having better behavior in school by their teachers than the children who hadn't had the Nellie program. So this very structured language intervention appears to improve children's concentration and reduce their impulsiveness and make them better behaved in schools. And that's evidence from a randomized trial, which I think is very important. So yes, Nellie improves reading, language, and children's behavior. And it's cheap, and it's scientifically got the best evidence probably of any intervention of its sort in the world. So as you can see, I think it's quite a good thing.
I love it. Turn your mics on, everybody, as we close out. I think having your voices talk to Charles will be great. So if you want to ask Charles a question, Lynn Kuhn, go ahead. You want to ask it verbally? Go ahead, turn your mic on.
Well, I was just curious. I happen to have read an article because Charles Perfetti speaks about the integrity of spoken language, and he's done quite a bit of research with the implications for deaf readers. So I was wondering, have you interacted with that population with your materials?
We haven't used language screen or Nellie with the deaf, no. Though we're collaborating with a group in the University of Cambridge who are starting a large-scale study of children with not deaf children per se, but children with varying levels of hearing loss. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Hi, Laura. Nice to meet you.
Hi, we met in 2022 at Big Sky.
Oh, right. Gosh.
We did. With using Nellie as a language intervention, that's 20-week program, do you have any recommendations with pairing it, ever to pair it with a specific reading intervention? You let Nellie run its course and then address explicit language, explicit reading skills? I'm thinking mostly for our students who have significant language delays when they come to us in kindergarten. And there is pressure for my district to, expose them to grade level instruction, even though they're many years behind in language. And I just would love to hear if you recommend doing all at once, or let's tackle language first, since it is the foundation. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, so I think practically Nellie would work very well alongside a high quality phonic reading program. So you're tackling the foundations of reading in Nellie, and you're doing high quality reading instruction in parallel with it.
Charles, to elaborate on that, if we're talking about a kindergartner in the United States where we have these high pressure grade level standards, a lot of alphabet, a lot of phonemic awareness, a lot of early CVC structure, what I've found in practicality is to deeply understand that simple view process of we build language and then we move into letter naming and sound and build language and then move into mapping that sound system onto the printed system.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to express is that there's an integrative experience. It's not I teach the alphabet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I do Nelly over here in the morning. It's really complex in reality, in real time in schools, because they're like, no, we teach this curriculum and they have to have this curriculum. And it's like, yes, we're going to take the essence of the early reading out of this curriculum and combine it with the actual evidence-based language instruction. At least that's where we've been in the pilot study and the work that I've been doing. So Laura, you do both, but for those, I want to further address, for the students who are more at risk, below the 10th percentile, Charles, we found that we needed to they needed language only. So we had to have cut points, Laura. We had to say, these students need language only. I'm not going to sit here and kill the alphabet because that's just like flashcard. It felt like this is not okay. We had to build language before we could move into early literacy. So that was a subset of students within that we made that decision about. So hopefully that helps you in practical terms.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I had a similar question to Laura. This is Vicky. And I'm thinking about, because of staffing and things getting so complex, like a burst of service. So when you talked about Nelly kind of running over weeks for a period of time, can it be more concentrated? Like if you could figure out, because of the challenges of like pulling kids out of curriculum, can you concentrate it and deliver it intensely? Or is it something that, because language kind of evolves over time and it's like laying down layers, that it needs to be spread out?
Okay, that's a very good question, Vicky. It's also quite a complicated question. So all I can say is we've done a series of randomized controlled trials, which are the gold standard for providing evidence of effectiveness, and those have looked at Nelly delivered over 20 weeks. And then there is a principle in cognitive psychology called distributed practice that says that doing stuff across time is more effective than doing everything all in a very concentrated way, which we call mass practice. So I would say that I wouldn't recommend that schools take Nelly and try and do it in 10 weeks instead of 20 weeks, because you're moving away from a distributed practice to a more of a mass practice model. But I mean, fundamentally, I think the elements in much of the evidence we have about Nelly is from schools that are doing less than all of it. Many schools are given the 20-week program, and because of we were doing this through COVID, right? And many schools were only doing 12 or 15 weeks of the 20 weeks, and those were all put into our analyses of the effectiveness of the program. So I would say schools should use Nelly, use it as faithfully to the way it was designed to be used as possible. But we're realists, and we know that often schools are short of time and end up doing less than the whole program, but they still seem to get positive effects from it.
I have a question. This is Amy from Wisconsin. I'm wondering if, can the assessment be used just as an assessment, or must you also use the Nelly intervention?
No, you can absolutely use Language Screen by itself.
Okay. And do you have we have a system that requires weekly progress monitoring for reading. And I'm wondering if they didn't use your reading assessment, or even if they did, what are districts using that are more frequent progress monitoring that you're aware of? Is there a system that complements the data? I worry about apples to oranges comparisons with data.
I don't know about progress monitoring. I mean, to be honest, I think that we shouldn't be testing children too often. You know, we identify children's level of skill, we teach them. We don't need to be measuring their progress on a weekly basis. We need to be giving them high quality teaching. And we know that the things we're teaching, like reading and language, don't change very quickly, right? So, but you can absolutely use reading screen and language screen without using any of our interventions. Yeah, we think it's very important to provide the language intervention. It's just because schools say, okay, we now know that lots of our children have language difficulties. What do we do about it? Well, the thing to do about it is to use an evidence-based language intervention like Nellie.
Yeah. And to further that answer, Amy, is that in the work that I've been doing, we use Acadience. So we move right into that because it does have the CBM protocol. And I think it was really valuable to hear you say that, Dr. Hulme, because Dr. Fletcher talked about that the most important thing you will ever do is teach a child. And if we don't teach them with evidence-based curriculum, we're not going to be able to truly find if they're at risk and true positives for a difference or disability. It's the great teaching that changes their lives, but our policies in the United States, I don't know if all y'all can say what your policies have, but I know mine here in Montana, you know, it's very ambiguous what instruction is. It's just, oh, best practice and have fun figuring that out. And so we need a lot of clarity, and some policies are better than others. But what we do know is that for my own experience, and I believe we could back this up with some research, is that teachers who have the data at their fingertips, well, Carol Connor did a lot of this work, Charles, with when they have the data.
Carol very well. Yeah, I knew Carol very well.
Yeah, I know. So Carol's work showed us that teachers who had that evidence at their fingertips and they were able to group with dynamic assessment and small group instruction, their students did better in their classrooms. So that's kind of where I think these policies are asking us to have these progress monitoring probes in place. And so having the interim is what language screen and reading screen are interim assessments, that if that's the language you use, the benchmarking, and then the in-between time that becomes more within curricular measurement of what we're teaching. As Anita Archer says, I hope my students learn what I teach. So what I teach is what they learn. And but it doesn't help you in terms of policy, Amy, in terms of saying, well, we did this amazing gold standard screener and we found all these students. Now I got a progress monitor. What I found with language screen is monitoring was we just did great instruction, and 6 months later we screened again, and boom, the data was so different in 6 months after great instruction. And teachers were paying attention and they were formatively cycling in a way that was appropriate. However, we didn't get caught up in the weeds of like, do I have an exact protocol of my progress monitoring? We just said, let's just do great instruction. And it made a massive difference. So it's a hard answer. We're not there yet. Okay, it's top of the hour, definitely a little past the hour. And yeah, thank you, Lynn. If you have any more questions, does anybody have any more questions before we sign off? That was a great hour. I think it was power packed. It was filled with information that hopefully, poof, blew your minds a little bit. It's really important to broaden our understanding of where the science is and what we truly can do for early learning, screening, and intervention. I know that it will start to change the trajectory and how well our students learn to read if we start early enough. And Charles, can you clarify the age span? We can start at 3 or 3.5 with language screen.
Yeah, 3.5, I'd say. Yeah.
Okay. And then we can go through, obviously we talked about the age span and Charles is expanding on that with more research. So, all right, it's going to be a great learning. If you have any further interest in this, please know that Sarah Hearn is on with Charles. They're both on the same team of OXED. I can connect you, and I believe Sarah and Charles, we could probably get a email out to y'all with some just additional information that you can follow through and look at stuff. And then make
Sure.
connections with Sarah and Charles individually if you want to follow through for your schools, for your states, whatever you would like to set up a different call to share this information with someone else. We want you to spread the good word because we know leading well in literacy is going to hinge upon understanding the language foundations of reading. And this will be a critical lever for change in your leadership and the work that you do. So thank you so much. Charles, any additional thoughts?
Just one thing, if anybody would like to try Language Screen, you can use the test absolutely free of charge with no payment whatsoever for a week. You could test your whole class with Language Screen and see if you like it, if you want to. And any school in the US that wants to trial Nelly, we'd be very happy to talk to you and provide the Nelly program at a reduced cost for you to evaluate in the US. It's already being used in some schools in the US, but we're keen for other schools to try it and experience it.
Thank you, Charles. It's very generous. Brenda, you have a quick question?
I do have a quick one. So I'm actually from Canada, and this is like super interesting to me. We do a lot of, our ministry does the Hannon. They want our daycares and stuff to be trained in the Hannon program. And we were just looking for something within our schools. Like, this is wonderful. I have like many more questions and things that I would love to be in contact with you at some point, if that would be possible.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to you, Brenda. So if we get Nell to pass on the list of emails in this meeting, we'll send out some general information and then you can get back to us and we can set up a call and talk to you. Yeah, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Brenda, which part of Canada are you in?
We're in Saskatchewan.
Okay, because we've had some quite extensive conversations with people in Ontario, but we've not spoken to anyone in Saskatchewan. So yeah, we'd love to talk to you about Language Screen and Nelly and how we could work with you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
Again, I will send out an email, and if you are on this call and you were an invited guest by a friend and you don't get the email, just make sure you talk to your friend and make sure you know how to get this information. Sarah has dropped some in the chat box that says directly how to get the free trial of Language Screen. We know I've worked with Charles and Sarah a lot. They have this great little packet of links for you that you can go explore. We really want to help you get the right stuff in your schools. And from Jack Fletcher to Charles Hulme, I don't think you could have heard from two greater researchers about that this is supposed to be simple and effective, and you want to find the right kids as early as possible and apply great instruction to really do this work well. And then we'll see, I think, a bigger liftoff in what the science can do for literacy across America. So thank you so much for joining this mentorship call. And we are grateful for your presence in this holiday season. So I hope you go have a great holiday and be in touch, and we'll keep learning together. Okay, bye-bye. And oh, wait, we're going to wrap up tomorrow for all of you on mentorship, do a wrap up on Wednesday, on the Wednesday Wisdom, and continue to talk about this and introduce something new and exciting as well. So we hope to see you on Wednesday. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Nell. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Good night.